August 28, 2025. The Kremlin's walls tremble, not from NATO bombs or Ukrainian artillery, but from the fury of a dictator who has just realized he has been humiliated on the world stage. Kim Jong-Un, the most isolated leader on the planet, has just declared war, not against the United States, not against South Korea, but against the one man he thought was his protector, Vladimir Putin. What you're about to witness is not a traditional military campaign. It is the story of betrayal, vengeance, and the catastrophic cost of underestimating a dictator whose pride was shattered. 40,000 North Korean troops, wiped out in Ukraine, fed into the grinder of Putin's failing war machine. And for the first time in decades, Kim Jong-un is striking back directly at a supposed ally. This isn't geopolitics. This is a mafia-style vendetta where blood debts are paid not in money, but in corpses. It began quietly in the early days of summer 2025. North Korean soldiers had been bleeding out on Ukrainian soil for months. Entire brigades disappeared into the mud of Kursk and Donetsk. Families back home received no answers. Letters went unanswered. Whole villages realized their sons were never coming back. State television showed nothing but victory parades, but the whispers were too loud to ignore. Even in one of the most tightly controlled societies on Earth, questions began to leak through the cracks. Why were elite North Korean units, trained for decades to fight the South, dying in Russia's war? Why were coffins returning in the dead of night, unloaded under heavy guard, hidden from the public eye? By July, the death toll had reached a staggering 40,000. That's not a statistic. That's an entire generation of fighting-aged men erased for a war they didn't choose. And then came the breaking point. At a state funeral held in Pyongyang, Kim Jong-un stood before thousands of weeping families. The coffins, draped in North Korean flags, stretched further than the eye could see. Cameras caught him clenching his fists so tightly his nails dug into his palms. His eyes were red, not just with grief, but with rage. For the supreme leader, whose entire image rests on absolute control, the sight of his military gutted was unbearable. And in that moment, something inside him snapped. For months he had played Putin's game, believing promises of advanced technology, food shipments, and nuclear assistance. But the truth was undeniable. He had been conned, humiliated, and bled dry. And when the realization hit, Kim Jong-un did what no one expected. He turned his fury not inward, not toward his generals or his people, but directly at Moscow. Russian intelligence sources now confirm what was once unthinkable. North Korean artillery units, positioned along the Russian border in Primorsky Krai, opened fire without warning on August 21st. Dozens of Russian outposts were obliterated in minutes. Videos smuggled out of the region show Russian soldiers scrambling, unprepared, stunned that their so-called ally had become their executioner. Eyewitnesses described the night sky lit up with rockets, the thunder of artillery rolling across the Amur River like an earthquake. Kim had unleashed his vengeance, and it was ruthless. For Putin, who had built his strategy on manipulation and deceit, this was the nightmare scenario, a pawn that refused to play its role, striking back with ferocity that even the Kremlin had underestimated. But Kim's attack wasn't random. It was calculated, methodical, and aimed at the very heart of Russia's vulnerability. He knew Putin's eastern defenses were weak, stripped bare to reinforce the crumbling front lines in Ukraine. He knew Russia's supply chains were stretched, its soldiers exhausted, its people weary of war. And most importantly, he knew Putin's ego couldn't withstand the humiliation of being attacked by the very man he had mocked and manipulated. Every rocket Kim fired wasn't just a weapon, it was a message. You turned me into the world's most expensive fool, and now you'll pay in blood. Western intelligence analysts are calling this the most dangerous rupture in authoritarian alliances since World War II.
On one hand, Putin is still bogged down in Ukraine, losing men and material at unsustainable rates. On the other, he now faces a furious dictator on his eastern flank, a man who no longer cares about consequences, who no longer fears sanctions, isolation, or even annihilation. Kim Jong-un has been psychologically broken, but out of that breakdown has emerged something even more dangerous, a dictator with nothing left to lose. And the scale of the violence is staggering. Reports indicate that in the first week of attacks, North Korean forces killed over 2,000 Russian soldiers, destroyed ammunition depots, and seized armored vehicles abandoned in the chaos. Russian commanders, blindsided, scrambled to redirect units away from Ukraine to contain the assault, but the damage had already been done. Putin's grand illusion of control was shattered. His ally had become his enemy, and the world was watching as two nuclear-armed dictators clawed at each other's throats. What makes this story even more extraordinary is the psychological warfare behind it. For years, Putin has thrived by breaking other leaders, manipulating their insecurities, turning them into puppets. But with Kim, he went too far. He didn't just humiliate a dictator, he annihilated his pride. And pride for Kim Jong-un is everything. Once stripped of it, the only thing left was vengeance. This isn't diplomacy. This isn't strategy. This is a blood feud between tyrants. A personal war that threatens to drag millions into the fire.
The images now flooding international media are surreal. Russian border towns reduced to rubble, their inhabitants fleeing in panic. North Korean troops advancing under banners soaked in the blood of comrades lost in Ukraine. Pyongyang broadcasting triumphant footage of captured Russian soldiers kneeling before Kim's portrait. And through it all, the Kremlin remains silent, issuing vague denials, insisting the alliance is intact, even as explosions light up the eastern horizon. Putin, the master manipulator, the predator who devoured allies, is now being hunted by the very monster he thought he controlled. And make no mistake, this isn't just about territory or revenge. It's about survival. Kim Jong-un knows he can't outlast Russia in a prolonged war, but he also knows he doesn't need to. All he has to do is humiliate Putin, to expose him as weak, to show the world that the Russian bear can bleed. Every strike, every ambush, every coffin returning to Moscow is a dagger in Putin's image of invincibility. And for Kim, that is victory enough. Music. This is what happens when monsters turn on each other. 40,000 North Korean soldiers died believing they were fighting for an ally. In reality, they were pawns sacrificed in a con game. And now their deaths are being avenged not with diplomacy, not with negotiations, but with fire and steel. Kim Jong-un has declared a personal war on the Kremlin, and the world is holding its breath, watching the unimaginable unfold. A dictator crying over coffins one month and launching artillery at Moscow the next. This is modern history's darkest irony, when two tyrants who trusted no one finally realized they should never have trusted each other. The Kremlin's initial reaction was disbelief. Putin, accustomed to total control over his puppets, dismissed the first artillery strikes as isolated accidents, the work of rogue North Korean units acting without orders. State television in Moscow replayed old footage of him and Kim smiling, shaking hands, eating lavish banquets, insisting the friendship was unbreakable. But inside the Ministry of Defense, panic was spreading like wildfire. Satellite images confirmed massed North Korean artillery formations along the border. Drone footage revealed convoys of tanks moving toward Russian territory, and intercepted communications left no doubt this wasn't an accident. It was war. By the second week, the border region of Primorsky Krai had transformed into a battlefield unseen since World War II. Russian bases, hastily fortified, came under relentless shelling. Columns of conscripts, pulled from Ukraine overnight, were thrown into the fight only to be annihilated by waves of North Korean rockets. Local Russian commanders described the fighting as chaos without logic. Soldiers who had trained for trench warfare in Ukraine suddenly found themselves ambushed in dense forests, hunted by fanatical North Korean commandos wielding night vision equipment smuggled in from China. Every tree line concealed a threat. Every road became a killing field. But Kim's strategy wasn't just military, it was psychological. Pyongyang began broadcasting captured Russian soldiers on state television, parading them in front of cameras, forcing them to confess to betraying the Korean people.
For a leader obsessed with image, Putin found these broadcasts unbearable. Russian families watched in horror as their sons, beaten and broken, appeared on foreign TV. Mothers began demanding answers. How could their sons be captured by an ally? Why was the Kremlin silent? Every broadcast eroded the illusion of control Putin had built. The predator had become the prey, his soldiers humiliated on screens from Seoul to Washington. Western intelligence agencies were stunned. The CIA described it as a fracture in the authoritarian axis no one predicted. NATO officials quietly debated whether to intervene, not to protect Russia, but to contain the chaos. Ukraine, meanwhile, seized the opportunity with brutal efficiency. As Russian reinforcements were pulled east to fight Kim, Ukrainian forces launched massive counteroffensives in Donbass, reclaiming villages and cities once thought lost forever. Videos of Ukrainian flags being raised over liberated towns flooded social media, further humiliating Moscow. Putin was trapped, bleeding in Ukraine, bleeding in the east, and bleeding credibility worldwide. And the numbers were staggering. Independent analysts estimated that in the first month of conflict, over 12,000 Russian troops had been killed or wounded by North Korean attacks. Fuel depots burned for days. Supply trains were derailed by precision strikes. Entire airfields were rendered useless by swarms of kamikaze drones supplied quietly by Pyongyang's back channels with Iran. The Russian vaunted military, already battered by 2 years of Ukrainian resistance, was now collapsing under the weight of betrayal. Inside Pyongyang, Kim basked in the spectacle. State television ran endless montages of North Korean artillery barrages, intercut with footage of Putin's speeches about eternal friendship. The message was clear: the Russian president was a liar, a coward, and now an enemy. At a rally in Kim Il-sung Square, Kim Jong-Un stood before hundreds of thousands of cheering citizens and thundered, "The Russian bear thought it could devour the Korean people. Instead, it will choke on its own blood." The crowd roared. Fireworks lit up the night sky. For a nation long starved of victories, this was intoxicating. But the war was not one-sided. The Kremlin struck back with fury. Russian bombers pounded North Korean positions with cluster munitions. Cruise missiles slammed into border towns, flattening entire neighborhoods. Civilians fled into makeshift shelters as the earth shook under Russian retaliation. But Kim had anticipated this. His forces had dug vast tunnel networks, stretching for miles, invisible to satellites. Russian bombs fell on empty trenches, while North Korean units re-emerged behind enemy lines, striking again and again. It was a war of shadows, and in the shadows, Kim's soldiers thrived. What made this conflict even more surreal was the propaganda battle raging online. Russian state media branded Kim a mad dog, accusing him of treason, insanity, and betrayal. North Korean outlets fired back, labeling Putin the Butcher of Kursk, a man who tricked Korea into sending 40,000 young men to die. Social media exploded with memes, footage, and conspiracy theories. On TikTok, a viral trend emerged showing side-by-side images of Kim crying at soldiers' funerals and then smiling as rockets rained down on Russia. The message was simple: never underestimate the vengeance of a dictator scorned. As the weeks dragged on, whispers of a greater danger began to circulate. Both leaders command nuclear arsenals. Both are cornered, humiliated, and desperate. And history has shown that desperate dictators rarely back down. U.S. intelligence reports indicated North Korean missile units had been placed on high alert. Russian nuclear submarines, once stationed in the Arctic, were spotted moving toward the Pacific. The world watched with dread, knowing one miscalculation could ignite a catastrophe beyond imagining. Yet behind the madness, there's cold, ruthless logic. Kim Jong-un knows he cannot destroy Russia. What he can do is bleed it, humiliate it, and prove to the world that no one, not even Putin, can manipulate him without consequences. Putin, meanwhile, faces an impossible choice. If he withdraws from the east, he cedes territory and prestige. If he escalates, he risks overextending an already broken military. And if he contemplates peace, he must do so with a man who has made his humiliation public, a man who will never forgive, never forget. And through it all, the coffins keep coming. Russian families bury their sons in silence, told they died defending the motherland. North Korean families do the same, told their sons died defeating the Russian traitor. But everyone knows the truth. This isn't about nations, ideology, or even survival. It's about ego, pride, and vengeance between two men who see the world not as allies and enemies, but as predators and prey. And now, for the first time, the predators are devouring each other. The battlefield in eastern Russia is a wasteland of fire and smoke. Drone footage shows endless columns of burning vehicles, forests reduced to ash, rivers choked with the wreckage of tanks. Survivors speak of combat so intense it feels apocalyptic. Russian deserters flee into Siberia. North Korean soldiers march with grim determination, shouting oaths of vengeance for their fallen comrades. Every battle feels like the last, yet the war drags on, fueled not by strategy, but by pure hatred. Inside the Kremlin, rage consumed Putin. Leaked transcripts from emergency security meetings paint a portrait of a leader unhinged, shouting at generals, slamming his fists against the table, demanding the head of Kim Jong-Un on a plate. His top commanders urged caution, warning that escalating too far could spark Chinese intervention. But Putin refused to listen. He screamed, "He made me look weak, and weakness is death." The Russian president, once feared for his icy calculation, was now consumed by personal fury, mirroring the very rage that had driven Kim to turn on him. Two dictators, mirrors of each other, locked in a spiral of vengeance neither could escape. And in Beijing, alarm bells were ringing. China, long the uneasy patron of North Korea and a reluctant partner of Russia, now faced a nightmare scenario. Two of its closest allies tearing each other apart in a war that threatened to destabilize Asia. Chinese state media called for restraint, but internal reports leaked to foreign journalists revealed the truth. Beijing was terrified. A war between Kim and Putin risked spilling across borders, disrupting trade routes and sparking refugee crises. Worse, it risked drawing in the United States, which had already begun moving carriers into the Pacific under the guise of stability operations. The chessboard of global power was tilting dangerously, and China was caught in the middle. For intelligence agencies in Washington and London, the fracture was both opportunity and danger. On one hand, Russia's military was being gutted on two fronts. On the other, a desperate Putin with nuclear weapons was a scenario that kept analysts awake at night. CIA director briefings described the situation as an unfolding catastrophe with no breaks. British MI6 reports described Kim's rhetoric as apocalyptic, noting his obsession with portraying himself as the avenger of his fallen troops. Western leaders debated quietly whether to exploit the chaos or try to contain it. The stakes were nothing less than global stability. On the ground, the war was brutal beyond comprehension. Russian soldiers described facing North Korean troops who fought with a ferocity bordering on suicidal, charging into machine gun fire, refusing to surrender even when surrounded. Survivors spoke of entire companies of North Koreans fighting to the last man, leaving Russian units traumatized and shattered. One Russian conscript, captured on audio later leaked online, could be heard sobbing. "They're not human. They don't stop. They just keep coming." North Korean propaganda glorified these sacrifices, broadcasting footage of soldiers vowing to die for vengeance, swearing oaths before portraits of Kim. In both countries, the war was sold as holy, inevitable, a battle that would define history. And yet, beneath the blood and fire, both regimes trembled. Russia faced the possibility of collapse on its eastern frontier. North Korea risked total annihilation if the conflict spiraled out of control. But neither leader could back down. To do so would mean humiliation greater than death. For Putin, retreat meant admitting he had been outplayed by the very dictator he once mocked as a pawn. For Kim, retreat meant betraying the memory of 40,000 dead soldiers whose blood he had sworn to avenge. And so the war dragged on. A war with no logic, no strategy, only vengeance. And the longer it lasted, the more the world realized the terrifying truth. This wasn't a war between nations. It was a duel between egos, fought with armies, waged with missiles, paid for in human lives. And as the body count climbed into the tens of thousands, one question echoed across every capital. How far will these two men go before the world burns with them?